The ship was wrong in the way that only very old things can be wrong, not broken, not decayed, but settled into a grammar of purpose that no longer matched the universe around it. The Vreth survey team felt this the moment their boarding umbilical sealed against the outer hull. The metal sang at frequencies, the team's spines registered as threat adjacent, a vibration that carried no chemical signature, no colony marker, nothing their distributed network could classify as alive or dead. The hull simply insisted on itself, quietly in the dark. Coordinator This of 7 led the entry. She was not one body but 7, her cognition braided across 7 radial frames that moved through the airlock in single file, each feeling the corridor's geometry through the soles of their adhesion pads, the collective mind assembling the ship's interior from 7 overlapping maps of pressure and electromagnetic shadow. The corridor was vast by any standard, wide enough for 3 Vreth abreast, tall enough for 2 stacked. The scale made no chemical sense. Nothing in Vreth architecture wasted volume. Every cubic unit of enclosed space was resource, was substrate, was potential colony room. But this corridor gave nothing back. It simply extended, ribbed with conduit housings and bracket-mounted equipment whose function the team's chemical memory archive could not place, lit by emergency strips that had burned on backup power for 5,000 years without complaint. This of 7 processed the scale problem and filed it as builders who did not think in colony units, builders for whom individual volume was the base measurement. She had read the xenographic surveys. She understood, in the way one understands a theorem without feeling its truth, that the ship had been built by the absent ones, the species whose ruins appeared on 7 worlds across the shattered reach, who had left behind structures of bewildering robustness and then simply stopped. The surveys said they were called humans. The surveys said they were believed extinct. What the surveys had not conveyed, because no survey team had ever entered a vessel of this class, was that the absent ones had built their warships to be patient. Tova Marksek heard the airlock cycle from the forward observation bay, where she had been cataloging targeting array components for the past 6 hours. She set down her stylus with great care, as she always did when her hands wanted to shake, and pulled up the internal sensor grid on her wrist plate. 14 biosignatures, radially symmetrical, low thermal variants, clustered near the outer hull. The Vreth, then. She had been told the survey team would arrive within the week. She had not been told they would board without hailing first. She stood still for a moment, breathing the ship's recycled air, which tasted faintly of iron and long-chain polymers, and something her body still insisted on calling home, despite the fact that she had never lived anywhere like this, had never lived in an era anything like the one that had built it. The ISV Unrelenting Patience was not her ship in any possessive sense. She was its custodian, dispatched by the Interstellar Heritage Commission to assess and catalog before the Vreth Compact's survey mandate expired, and the question of salvage rights became political. She had been alone aboard it for 11 weeks. In 11 weeks, she had learned that the ship had opinions. Not cognition, she was careful about that word, careful the way xenobiologists are careful, because precision is the only courtesy available across cognitive chasms. But the ship had thresholds, and the thresholds had logic, and the logic had been built into it by people who had expected to use it. The weapons systems were the clearest example. They were not simply dormant. They were waiting, in the specific way that a trap waits, coiled, patient, requiring only the correct sequence of inputs to become purposeful again. She had spent 3 of her 11 weeks mapping every dormant threshold she could find and marking them in her wrist plate with red. The Vreth were heading, she saw from the sensor grid, directly toward the largest concentration of red. She started moving. The Vreth called the large chamber the heart of purpose. This was not a translation. This of 7 had no translation apparatus and no interest in one, but a chemical memory analog, the closest her distributed network could come to nomming a space whose function resonated at the right frequency. The chamber was circular, domed, and filled with instrumentation arranged in concentric rings around a central platform. The platform held a chair. The chair held restraints. The instrumentation held. In the magnetic signatures This of Seven read through the floor. Enormous stored potential, energy coiled in superconducting loops, waiting in the patient way of very large things. The team spread out along the outer ring. One of This of Seven's bodies, the one she thought of as her third left, though the distinction was social rather than biological, extended a sampling tendril toward the nearest console. The console's surface was covered in markings. Tactile markings, raised slightly from the panel in a repeating geometry. Her third left ran the tendril across them carefully, reading their spacing, their pressure profile, the electromagnetic bleed from the circuitry beneath. The markings were not decorative. This of Seven filed this immediately into her colony memory as, "This is a language made for touching." And then, because she was a scientist and scientists cannot help themselves, her third left pressed the largest and most central of the raised markings. The chamber said something in light and sound. Red light, which This of Seven's magnetic senses registered as electromagnetic warning frequency. A low tone, which her vibration spines registered as large mass moving below. Then the central platform began to descend. Tova came through the starboard access hatch at a run, which she immediately regretted, because 14 Vreth pivoting simultaneously toward a running human in a confined space produced a quality of attention that her hindbrain classified as predation adjacent, even though she knew perfectly well that the Vreth were not predators. Her hindbrain was not interested in what she knew perfectly well. She stopped. She held her hands open at her sides, which was a gesture that meant nothing to the Vreth and everything to her own nervous system. A way of telling herself she was choosing not to be afraid. "Stop," she said, in Vreth trade chord, which was not a spoken language and which she produced by pressing the resonance pads on her wrist plate. "Please. That sequence you activated is." The platform completed its descent with a sound like a settling mountain. Beneath it, revealed, was a weapons interface that Tova had cataloged in week 4 and marked in red 3 times and written 2 separate memos to the commission about. The interface was active. Its initialization light was green. In 5,000 years it had never been green. The Vreth team stood around it in their loose radial cluster, spines registering the electromagnetic output of a charging rail system that could, Tova knew from the ship's technical records, accelerate a 4-ton projectile to a significant fraction of light speed. The ship was patient. It had been waiting for someone to finish the sequence. This of Seven felt the charge building through the souls of her 7 bodies and understood in the chemical deep way that Vreth understand mortal things, that something had gone wrong. The heart of purpose was not a ceremonial space. It was a mechanism, and the mechanism was cycling. She turned her distributed attention toward the one entity in the room who had arrived running and who was now standing very still with its upper limb spread open, a posture This of Seven had no category for but which her network agreed, across all 7 frames, communicated something. Not aggression, not submission, something that sat between them like a third concept she didn't have a name for. The entity spoke in chords. Bad chords, imprecise frequency, wrong overtone ratios clearly produced by a mechanical approximation rather than proper spine-to-substrate resonance. But chords, trade chord, recognizable imperfectly as language. This of Seven processed this. The absent one spoke Vreth. Not well, not natively. The way a deep-water creature might learn to navigate shallows, functional, laborious, full of the particular clumsiness of a body working against its own design. But the words were there. And the words were, "I can stop it. Follow me, please." Please was not a concept This of Seven's colony memory had a clean analog for. It was not a word of information. It was a word that did something else, that placed the speaker in a position of acknowledged vulnerability, that asked for a response that could be refused. This of Seven had studied 12 sapient species. She had never encountered that precise word shape used in a crisis. Most species under pressure commanded, requested, signaled. The absent one was doing something more structurally unusual. It was making itself smaller in order to be heard. She filed this as significant, unexplained, worth following. She sent 3 of her bodies forward. The corridor to the weapons control junction was 40 meters of red emergency lighting and Tova Marksak's own heartbeat, which she could hear very clearly. 3 Vreth followed her at a distance of approximately 2 meters, their adhesion pads making no sound on the deck plating, their spines fanned and reading everything. She did not look back at them. Looking back would slow her down, and she did not have time to be slow. The interface junction was behind a manual release panel, which the ship's designers had made manual precisely because an electronic lock could be hacked and a physical bolt could not. Tova had a key. She had made a point of having keys to everything, and she used it now, wrenching the panel open and exposing the junction's interrupt system. A nested set of mechanical relays that, if tripped in the correct sequence, would tell the weapon array that the fire solution had been aborted. She knew the sequence. She had memorized it in week 4, the way she memorized every sequence that could kill her, which was her only real survival strategy aboard a ship that had been built to kill things on a civilizational scale. She tripped the first relay. The hum in the deck plating changed pitch. One of the Vreth moved up beside her. Not threatening, it stopped a careful distance away, its radial body angled so that its spines were pointing at the junction rather than at her. Tova realized after a moment that it was reading the junction, magnetically, feeling the circuit topology with senses she didn't have, mapping the relay system from the inside. It extended a tendril toward the second relay. Tova froze. The Vreth's tendril hovered. It did not touch. It was asking something, or it was doing the Vreth equivalent of asking, which was making its intention visible, and then pausing long enough for the other party to object. Thys of Seven had learned this pause from her colony's archive on negotiated cohabitation. It was the gesture you made when you understood you were in someone else's space. Tova looked at the tendril, looked at the junction, looked back at the tendril. Yes, she said in chords and stood back. The Vreth tripped the second relay with a precision that her human fingers could not have matched. A simultaneous contact at 2 points separated by 11 millimeters, which required either very fine motor control or the functional equivalent of 2 independent fingers operated by the same distributed mind. The hum dropped. The third relay Tova handled herself, and after the fourth, the charging system completed its abort cycle with a series of diminishing tones that she felt leave her shoulders like a weather system. The ship was quiet. Thys of Seven stood in the silence and reprocessed everything. She had made an error. The error had come from misreading purpose, from interpreting an artifact of function as an artifact of ritual, from bringing Vreth pattern understanding to a space that had been built for a completely different kind of mind. The charge system had not been a mystery to be studied. It had been a loaded thing, and the appropriate response to a loaded thing was not curiosity. This was the kind of error you did not survive on a world with apex predators, the kind that had presumably, in other contexts, killed other Vreth. The absent one had not been triumphant about this, had not gestured or vocalized in any way that Thys of Seven's network could read as, "You were wrong." It had simply stopped the mechanism and then sat down on the deck plating, back against the corridor wall, eyes closed. Thys of Seven sent one body to sit near it. Not touching, the chemical data on human contact preference was unclear, and she erred toward distance, but near. The same way you sat near a colony mate who had survived something. After a while, the absent one opened its eyes. It looked at the body Thys of Seven had sent. Then it looked at the junction panel. Then it made a sound, not chords, not trade language, something below the threshold of communication. Thys of Seven's vibration spines registered it as chest cavity resonance, low amplitude, repeating pattern. Her network conferred. The absent one was making music, alone in a corridor after nearly dying, making music the way very small creatures make sounds in the dark, not for an audience, not for information transfer, but because the body needed to do something with the fact that it was still present. This of Seven did not have a category for this. She created one. The commissioned salvage hearing lasted 4 hours. Tova gave her testimony from the unrelenting patient's *S forward bay, with the star field behind her, and the Vreth survey team's full 14-body cluster visible in the corner of the frame, which she had requested, and which the commission members clearly found distracting. She was not sorry. She said, "The ship is not salvage. A ship is not salvage if it still has a custodian, and this ship has one, and she intends to remain." She said, "The Vreth Compact Survey mandate should be extended and expanded to include collaborative access." She said this carefully, with documentation, with the technical report on the weapons junction incident filed as Exhibit A, not to embarrass the Vreth team, but because accuracy required it, and because this of Seven had agreed that accuracy was the most useful form the story could take. She did not say, "This of Seven sat with me in the corridor for 2 hours." She did not say, "We did not share language well enough to talk about anything real, so I hummed and she did something with her spines that my wrist plate's sensor registered as low-frequency response in the same rhythm, and at some point that became the most honest conversation I had in 11 weeks." The commission approved the extended mandate, 3 votes to 2, on the condition that Tova submit monthly safety assessments. She submitted them. They were thorough and accurate and contained, in each one, a small section titled Observations on Vreth Cognition that the Commission never commented on but that this of Seven, who received copies as the Collaborative Access Agreement required, annotated in chemical memory and distributed to her full colony node for review. Over the following 2 years, those annotations accumulated into something that did not have a Vreth name yet, because it was a new thing, a growing record, a cross-species archive of how 2 kinds of mind had learned to sit near each other in the dark of a warship that had been built for a civilization that no longer existed, and had found in that silence that the ship's patience had not been the most remarkable thing aboard it. This of Seven's colony eventually proposed a name for the archive, in trade cord, which Tova's wristplate rendered imperfectly but well enough. Recognition. A word that meant, in Vreth, the moment a thing you could not classify becomes a thing you could not imagine not knowing. In the forward observation bay, on the 3rd anniversary of the boarding incident, Tova pinned the archive's cover notation to the bulkhead beside the targeting array components she had never finished cataloging. She did not need to finish them. She had found something more interesting to study. Outside, in the dark between stars, the ISV Unrelenting Patience continued its long drift, and its emergency strips continued to burn, and it kept its 5,000-year vigil over 2 species learning, slowly and imperfectly and without any guarantee of success, to read each other.